As we know, Donald Trump was on the ballot in 2016. He outperformed the polls then. In 2020, he also outperformed the polls. In 2022, he wasn't on the ballot, but the predicted red wave really failed to materialize. So how accurate, looking back at those past three elections, do you think the polls are in this, showing this dead heat?
Yeah. So I would say I think there is reason to suspect, and it's hard to know for sure until we get the results on election night or election week. But I would suspect that the polls are probably a little bit more accurate this time around. So if we think back to 2016, the big thing that the pollsters missed was white non-college voters. They were not accounting for a growing education divide among white voters. And so they sort of didn't anticipate that there was going to be this groundswell of support for Donald Trump. A lot of these pollsters fixed that in 2020, but then something else happened in 2020 that everybody remembers, which was the COVID pandemic. And partly the theory for why the polls were off that time is that there were a lot of Biden supporting voters who were at home, were likelier to kind of stay at home during COVID, not risk going outdoors, and were a little bit more isolated, maybe a little bit more lonely, and therefore more willing to answer pollsters' phone calls. And so pollsters were getting a little bit of an inaccurate representation of just how strong Joe Biden's support was. I mean, there were polls back in 2020 that had Joe Biden up by 18 points in Wisconsin. He only won Wisconsin by less than a point. So to give you a sense of how that worked out in 2022, in a lot of these states, the polls were accurate. There were some sort of partisan polls that kind of muddied the picture a little bit, but in a lot of the key swing states, they were spot on. So, presuming that we don't have these sort of major factors that people couldn't anticipate the last time around, I think it's fair to suspect that the polls will be pretty accurate this time. I also think you can kind of see this in the demographic crosstabs, where you can see that Harris is still leading at the national level, but she's actually struggling with groups like Black voters and Hispanic voters, at least compared to Joe Biden in 2020, which tells me that they've got the right overall margins at the top, because they're not overinflating her support among these key groups as well.